You are replaceable. Do not forget that. My father shouted those words across the dining room table, his face twisted in absolute rage. He thought I was just a sad single woman staring at computers all day. He had no idea that I was the only reason he was not living on the street. I looked around at the pristine house I paid for, the cars I leased for them, the luxurious lifestyle I funded single-handedly, and I simply smiled. If I am replaceable, I told him calmly, then so is everything I provide. They laughed in my face. They thought I was making a pathetic, empty threat. 3 days later, their credit cards declined and their world fell apart. Before I tell you exactly how I destroyed their perfect illusion and took back my life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who used you for their own gain. Growing up in our affluent neighborhood outside Atlanta, appearances were everything to my parents. My father, Reginald, was a retired local politician and a prominent figure at our church. He carried himself like a king who demanded absolute loyalty and expected his every command to be treated as gospel. My mother, Vivica, spent her days organizing charity galas and attending events with her prestigious sorority alumni group. To the outside world, we were the shining example of Black excellence. We were the family that other families looked up to, the ones who always wore the best clothes, drove the newest cars, and hosted the most extravagant holiday parties. But behind the heavy oak doors of our 6-bedroom home, the reality was a suffocating nightmare of conditional love and endless emotional manipulation. The rules of our house were simple and unspoken, but universally understood. Jamal, my older brother, was the golden child who could do no wrong. From the time he was a little boy, my parents treated him like royalty. His mistakes were excused as growing pains. His bad grades were blamed on teachers who did not understand his genius, and his complete lack of ambition was masked as a creative spirit searching for its true calling. I, Malika, was the workhorse expected to quietly support his greatness. I was 32 years old, the founder and chief executive officer of my own highly successful cybersecurity firm, yet in my parents' eyes, I was merely a financial safety net for their favorite child. I started my company from my cramped college dorm room while Jamal was throwing away his tuition money on parties. I worked sleepless nights to secure government contracts while my parents were busy paying off his credit card debts. Yet no matter how much success I achieved, I was always treated as secondary. The tension usually peaked on Sundays. Sunday dinner was a sacred tradition in our family, a weekly performance where we gathered after church to pretend we were a flawless unit. The dining room table was always set with my mother and her fine china and heavy silverware. The comforting smell of roasted chicken, baked macaroni and cheese, and slow-cooked collard greens filled the air. But the food always tasted like ashes in my mouth. I dreaded these dinners because they always followed the same exhausting script. This particular Sunday began just like any other. I arrived exactly on time, exhausted from a grueling 60-hour work week, fighting off cyber threats from my corporate clients. I took my usual seat near the end of the long mahogany table. Jamal sat at the head of the table opposite my father, holding court like he owned the place. Beside him sat his wife, Brittany. Brittany was a 31-year-old white woman who loved nothing more than spending money she did not earn. She was the kind of woman who acted overly familiar with Black culture when it suited her, but weaponized her privilege the second she felt challenged. She wore a designer dress that cost more than my first car, delicately sipping a glass of expensive imported wine that I had unknowingly paid for through the allowance I gave my parents. The conversation started with the usual boasting. Jamal was loudly explaining his latest brilliant idea to revolutionize the tech industry. He called it a groundbreaking cryptocurrency application that would change the global financial market. He used big buzzwords he clearly did not understand, waving his hands animatedly while my parents hung on his every word. My mother beamed at him with such intense adoration it made my chest ache. "That is my brilliant son," Vivica announced to the room, placing a hand over her heart. "You have always had the mind of a visionary, Jamal. The Lord is going to bless this new venture abundantly. I just know it in my spirit. I kept my head down, focusing on my plate, pushing my food around with my fork. I had heard this exact speech a dozen times before. There was the luxury car rental service that went bankrupt in 4 months. There was the exclusive real estate firm that folded before it even launched. Every single time Jamal had a grand vision. Every single time he needed capital. And every single time the money vanished into thin air, usually ending up in Brittany and her designer closet, or paying for their lavish vacations to tropical islands. Then the inevitable pivot happened. The room grew quiet as my father cleared his throat, adjusting his tailored suit jacket. He looked down the length of the table, directly at me. His eyes were cold, calculating, and completely void of any paternal warmth. Malika Reginald said, his voice dropping into the authoritative tone he used when he expected absolute obedience from his congregation. Your brother is standing on the precipice of greatness. This application of his is going to secure our family legacy for generations to come. But as you know, great ventures require initial capital to get off the ground and scale properly. I slowly placed my fork on my plate. I knew exactly where this was going. The trap had been set, and they were just waiting for me to walk into it. I looked at Jamal, who was suddenly very interested in his wine glass, refusing to make eye contact with me. Then I looked at Brittany, who was staring at me with a barely concealed smirk, already imagining how she would spend the funds. How much does he need this time, Dad? I asked, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. We need $150,000, Jamal blurted out before my father could answer. It is just seed money, Malika. Just enough to get the developers paid and launch the beta version. You will get it back tenfold in 6 months. I promise you, it is a guaranteed return on investment. I stared at him in disbelief. $150,000. He said it so casually, as if he were asking me to pass the salt across the table. They had no concept of what it took to earn that kind of money. They only knew how to spend it. I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar, suffocating weight of their expectations pressing down on my chest. I cannot do that, Jamal, I said simply. I do not have $150,000 of liquid cash just lying around to throw at a high-risk startup with no business plan and no real developers. The silence that followed was deafening. The grandfather clock ticking in the hallway suddenly sounded as loud as a hammer. No one in this family ever told Jamal no. I was the first one to break the sacred rule. Brittany was the first to attack. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh, swirling the wine in her glass. "Oh, please, Malika," she scoffed, her voice dripping with condescension. "Stop being so dramatic. We all know how much your little computer company makes. You are a single woman who spends all day staring at screens in the dark. You do not have a husband. You do not have children to feed. What exactly do you need all that money for anyway? It is not like you have a life to spend it on." The sheer audacity of her words left me momentarily speechless. This woman lived in a luxury condo that my business subsidized. She drove a car that my immaculate credit score secured. Yet she sat at my family dinner table drinking wine I bought and had the nerve to insult my life and my independence. I looked at my mother, expecting her to reprimand Brittany for such blatant disrespect. Instead, Vivica nodded in agreement, fixing me with a stern glare. "Brittany is right." "Malika," my mother said, her tone dripping with intense disappointment. "You are being incredibly selfish right now. Your brother is a black man trying to build an empire in a world that is stacked against him. It is your duty as a black woman to uplift him, to support him when he needs it. What is the point of all your financial success if you are not going to use it to elevate your own flesh and blood? The Lord blesses those who give to their family, not those who hoard their wealth out of spite and jealousy." I felt a cold, hard knot forming in my stomach. The manipulation was so blatant, tying my racial identity and my faith to my willingness to be a human bank account for a man who refused to work a normal job. I looked around the table at the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I saw no love. I only saw greed, immense entitlement, and deep-seated resentment. "I am not hoarding my wealth, Mom," I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady despite the anger boiling inside me. "I am protecting my business and my livelihood." Jamal has started 3 different companies in the past 4 years. Every single one of them has failed spectacularly. I paid off the massive debt from his luxury car rental disaster so he would not go to jail. I covered the exorbitant legal fees when his real estate partners sued him for gross negligence. I am not funding another fantasy project, just so Brittany can buy another closet full of designer bags while the business goes bankrupt. Brittany gasped loudly, placing a manicured hand on her chest, as if she had been physically struck by my words. Reginald slammed his fist onto the mahogany table with such brutal force that the crystal glasses rattled and spilled water onto the lace tablecloth. The sudden violence of the sound made me flinch, but I held my ground, keeping my posture rigid and straight. "How dare you speak to your brother and your sister-in-law that way?" My father roared, his face turning an angry, frightening shade of purple. He stood up, towering over the table, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You arrogant, ungrateful child. You think just because you have a little bit of money you can sit at my table and disrespect my son? You think you are better than us because you own some tech company nobody understands." "I am not saying I am better, Dad," I said, refusing to look away from his furious gaze. "I am saying I am done being financially abused by my own family. I am done working 80 hours a week so Jamal can play pretend and call himself an entrepreneur while contributing absolutely nothing." "You are nothing!" Reginald shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the dining room. "Do you hear me? You are nothing without the foundation this family gave you. You sit there in your expensive clothes acting like you built yourself from the ground up, but you carry my name. You are a woman alone in the world. Jamal is the future of this family name. He is the legacy we leave behind. You are just here to support that legacy." He leaned across the table, his eyes filled with a terrifying cold contempt that stripped away any remaining illusion that he cared for me as a daughter. "You listen to me very carefully, Malika," he sneered, spitting the words at me like venom. "You are replaceable. Do not forget that. The only reason you have a seat at this table is because we allow it. If you cannot fulfill your role in this family and support your brother, we will find someone else who can. Without us, you have absolutely nothing." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "You are replaceable." It was the ultimate insult, a declaration that my only value as a human being was my utility to them. If I stopped producing money, I ceased to matter completely. I looked at my mother. She was staring at me with her arms crossed, her expression stern and unforgiving, completely aligning herself with my father and his rage. I looked at Jamal, who was leaning back in his chair with a smug, victorious smile on his face, entirely comfortable letting our father tear me apart on his behalf. And I looked at Brittany, the woman who benefited most from my exhausting labor, who was practically glowing with sick satisfaction at seeing me violently put in my place. A strange, profound silence washed over my mind. For my entire life, I had lived in fear of this exact moment, the terrifying moment they would reject me forever. I had spent 32 years desperately trying to earn their love, writing massive checks, paying overdue bills, fixing legal disasters, all in the vain, stupid hope that one day they would look at me with the same fierce pride and adoration they reserved for Jamal. But in that single, brutal moment, the fear simply vanished from my body. It was replaced by a crystal clear, freezing cold realization. They did not love me. They loved my money. And without my money, they could not survive a single month in this massive house. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not defend myself or try to argue logic with people committed to misunderstanding me. I calmly picked up my linen napkin and wiped my mouth. I stood up from the table, smoothing the front of my dress. I looked around the beautiful dining room. I looked at the imported crystal chandelier hanging above us, the custom hardwood floors beneath our feet, the expensive original artwork adorning the walls. I knew exactly whose bank account had furnished this entire breathtaking lifestyle. I looked my father straight in the eyes, my voice completely steady and devoid of any emotion. "If I am replaceable," I said softly, making sure every syllable landed, "then so is everything I provide." My father let out a harsh, barking laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. Brittany giggled loudly into her wineglass, leaning into Jamal. My mother rolled her eyes and sighed with dramatic annoyance. "Oh, stop the theatrics," Malika Vivica said dismissively, picking up her fork. "Sit down and apologize to your father before you make things worse for yourself." They genuinely thought I was throwing a tantrum. They believed I was making an empty, pathetic threat because they were so accustomed to my eventual submission. They thought the obedient, desperate daughter would always come crawling back with a checkbook in hand to buy back their affection and secure her spot at Sunday dinner. I did not sit down. I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room without looking back. I walked through the grand foyer, opened the heavy mahogany front door, and stepped out into the warm Atlanta evening. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove away from the house I had secretly paid the mortgage on for 5 years. I left them laughing at the dinner table, absolutely certain of their untouchable power over me. They had no idea that their perfect, luxurious world was about to come crashing down. They had no idea that within 3 days their credit cards would decline, their cars would be repossessed, and they would be begging the replaceable daughter for mercy. Monday morning arrived with a crisp clarity I had not felt in years. Sitting in the corner office of my cybersecurity firm with the early sun casting long shadows across the skyline of Atlanta, I opened my personal laptop. The sleek glass desk was clear of any clutter, matching the sudden emptiness in my chest, where fear and obligation used to live. For 5 years, I had started my week by checking the balances on the 4 supplementary accounts I maintained for my family. It was a routine built on guilt and survival. Today, it was a demolition project. I logged into the Platinum banking portal. The dashboard loaded, displaying the massive outflow of cash that had funded my family and their delusion of grandeur. I clicked on the account assigned to Brittany. The transaction history was a masterclass in entitlement. $300 at a luxury spa, $800 at a designer boutique, $100 for artisan dog food. I did not hesitate. I moved my cursor to the Account Management tab and selected the option to permanently close the card. The screen prompted me for confirmation. I clicked Confirm and watched the status change to deactivated. A small smile touched my lips. Next was my mother. Vivica had a separate account specifically designated for her philanthropic galas and alumni association fees. Just last week, she had charged $2,000 for floral arrangements at a charity luncheon where she proudly introduced Jamal as the generous benefactor. I revoked her access with a single click. Then came my father. Reginald drove a custom black Porsche Cayenne that he paraded around his church and political alumni meetings as proof of his lifelong hard work. The lease was entirely in my name, drawn directly from my primary business checking account. I opened the auto-pay settings and canceled the recurring monthly transfer. I followed up by logging into the insurance portal and removing the vehicle from my policy effective immediately. If he wanted to drive a car that cost more than most people make in a year, he could figure out how to insure it. Finally, I addressed the most significant financial chain: the mortgage on the 6-bedroom estate they lived in. I had quietly purchased the property through a blind trust 2 years ago when they nearly lost it to foreclosure. They lived there under the delusion that it was still theirs, treating me like a guest in the house I owned. I stopped the automatic property tax payments and halted the maintenance fund that paid for their landscaping and pool cleaning services. Within 15 minutes, I had systematically dismantled the financial infrastructure of their entire lives. I closed my laptop, took a slow sip of my coffee, and went back to work. I felt absolutely nothing but peace. By Wednesday afternoon, the delayed fuse I had lit finally reached the powder keg. Brittany was hosting an elaborate afternoon tea for the wives of several prominent local investors. She had reserved the private conservatory at the most exclusive country club in the city, a venue that only allowed entry because my company paid the exorbitant annual membership dues. I can only imagine the scene based on the frantic voicemails I would later receive and the gossip that inevitably filtered back to me through the tight-knit circles of Atlanta. Brittany was reportedly holding court at the head of a long table draped in pristine white linen. Tiered silver trays of imported caviar, delicate pastries, and smoked salmon sandwiches sat before her guests. Vintage champagne flowed freely. She was dressed in a silk outfit paid for by my sweat, and she was aggressively pitching Jamal and his fake cryptocurrency application to the wealthy women around her. She spun a tale of a brilliant tech visionary on the verge of changing the world, portraying herself as the supportive, brilliant wife of a future billionaire. She conveniently left out the part where her husband had bankrupted 3 consecutive businesses and currently relied on his younger sister to keep his electricity turned on. She soaked up the admiration and envy of her peers, entirely secure in the illusion she had crafted. When the gathering began to wind down, the server approached quietly holding a discreet black leather folder containing the bill. The total with the private room fee, imported champagne, and mandatory gratuity came to just over $4,000. Brittany barely glanced at the receipt. With a practiced air of casual wealth, she slipped the heavy metal supplementary card I had given her into the folder and handed it back to the server without missing a beat in her conversation. 5 minutes later, the server returned. His professional smile was strained. He leaned down and whispered softly so as not to embarrass her, telling her that the card had been declined. Brittany supposedly laughed, waving her hand, as if the server had made a silly mistake. She ordered him to run it again, claiming it was a premium account with no limit. The server politely retreated and returned a moment later, shaking his head. He informed her that the system stated the account had been permanently closed. The silence at the table was immediate and suffocating. The wealthy women who had just been praising her sudden success stopped talking. Their eyes darted between Brittany and the server. In circles like that, wealth is assumed, and a declined card is the ultimate social disgrace. It shatters the facade instantly. Brittany's face flushed a deep, humiliating red. She quickly reached into her designer purse and pulled out another card, tying to Jamal's personal checking account. She handed it over, her voice losing its cultured edge. The server obliged. He brought it back a minute later, saying it declined for insufficient funds. The whispers started immediately. The other wives exchanged knowing glances. Brittany was trapped. She had ordered thousands of dollars worth of luxury items to impress women who were now looking at her with thinly veiled pity and disgust. Panicking, she excused herself and practically ran to the country club bathroom, locking herself inside a stall with her phone. At the exact same time across town, my father was experiencing his own sudden fall from grace. Reginald had pulled his gleaming Porsche Cayenne into a premium gas station near his favorite cigar lounge. He was wearing a tailored suit, preparing to meet with some former political associates to brag about his status and Jamal's upcoming venture. He filled the tank with premium gas and walked inside the convenience store to purchase his expensive imported water and mints. He approached the counter with the swagger of a man who believed the world owed him deference. He tossed the same supplementary metal card onto the counter. The cashier swiped it and it declined. Reginald frowned, adjusting his suit jacket. He told the cashier the machine was broken, using that heavy, booming voice he reserved for people he considered beneath him. He demanded the cashier run it again, asking if the man knew who he was. The cashier, unimpressed by his posturing, swiped it again and repeated that the account was closed, asking for another form of payment. A line was beginning to form behind him. Everyday working people who were simply trying to pay for their gas and go home. Reginald dug into his wallet, but he carried very little cash, relying entirely on the unlimited access he thought he had to my funds. He tried to open the banking app on his phone to transfer money, but his access credentials had been revoked. The login screen simply displayed an error message stating he was no longer an authorized user. The people in line began to grumble. Reginald, the proud former politician, the man who had looked me in the eye and told me I was replaceable, was forced to empty his pockets. He scraped together exactly $17 in crumpled bills and loose change, placing it on the counter in front of the impatient cashier. It was not enough to cover the tank of premium gas. He had to leave his gold watch as collateral, just to drive away from the station, thoroughly humiliated and stripped of his manufactured dignity. I sat at my desk watching the sunset paint the Atlanta skyline in shades of deep orange and purple. My phone, which had been sitting silently on the glass surface, suddenly lit up. The notifications began pouring in like a torrential flood. Missed calls from Brittany, missed calls from Jamal, missed calls from Reginald, missed calls from my mother. I did not answer a single one. I simply poured myself a fresh glass of sparkling water and opened the visual voicemail application, watching the audio transcripts generate in real time. The first voicemail was from Brittany. She was sobbing hysterically, the sound echoing against the tile of the country club bathroom. She demanded I call the bank right now, saying her card declined in front of everyone. She said she was literally trapped in the bathroom and the manager was threatening to call the police if she did not pay the $4,000 bill. She demanded I fix it immediately. The second was from Jamal. His voice was frantic, laced with the aggressive entitlement he always used when addressing me. He yelled, asking what was wrong with my accounts. He complained that Brittany was crying and his personal card bounced. He said Dad was blowing up his phone, saying his card was dead too. He ordered me to call the fraud department and get it sorted out before I ruined his business meetings. The third was from Reginald. The transcript captured his booming, furious voice perfectly. He commanded me to answer my phone. He stated the bank had made a massive error and closed his accounts. He complained about being humiliated at a gas station and ordered me to call my wealth manager right now to fix the error before he came down to my office to handle it himself. They genuinely thought it was a bank error. Their arrogance was so absolute, so deeply ingrained in their psychology, that the possibility of me deliberately cutting them off did not even register as a realistic scenario. They truly believed they owned me. They believed my obedience was a permanent, unbreakable law of nature. I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over the keyboard as I opened the family group chat, where they were all currently sending dozens of panicked messages demanding to know where I was and why the money was gone. I did not type a long explanation. I did not express my anger or air my grievances. I simply gave them exactly what my father had given me at the Sunday dinner table. I typed the response slowly, ensuring every word was deliberate and cold. Bank is fine. I just replaced myself. Ask your son to pay. I hit send. I watched the small indicator confirm that the message had been delivered to all of them. Then I went into my phone settings and temporarily muted the entire group chat, placing my phone face down on the desk. The silence in my office was beautiful. Miles away in the massive quiet house I paid for, the reality of my text message slammed into my mother like a freight train. Vivica stared at her phone screen, her perfectly manicured hands trembling. The text message left no room for misinterpretation. It was not a bank error. It was an execution. She walked through the grand foyer of the home, looking at the imported rugs, the expensive art, the luxury that defined her entire social existence. The realization dawned on her with terrifying clarity. If the credit cards were closed, then the mortgage was not being paid. The car leases were halted. The country club dues were bouncing. The entire foundation of their elite life had just been pulled out from under them in a single afternoon. Panic set in. She knew Jamal had absolutely nothing. His crypto application was a phantom designed to siphon money, not generate it. Without my income, they would be exposed to their wealthy friends and their church congregation as complete frauds. But Vivica was not a woman who accepted defeat or took responsibility for her actions. Her mind instantly shifted from panic to retaliation. If I thought I could simply walk away and cut them off, she would make sure I suffered the consequences. She would destroy my reputation before I could destroy hers. She picked up her phone and bypassed her husband and son. She opened her contacts and began to dial the numbers of the people who formed the backbone of their social enforcement. She called the church elders. She called her prominent sorority sisters. She called the extended family network of aunts and uncles who thrived on drama and demanded strict adherence to the culture of respecting your elders no matter the cost. The smear campaign was about to begin. Vivica was preparing to weaponize the entire extended family against me, twisting the narrative to paint herself as the helpless victim and me as the unhinged, abusive daughter. She decided right then and there that she would burn my life to the ground if it meant forcing me back into submission. She had no idea that I was already 10 steps ahead, waiting for her to make her next move. The digital assault began precisely at 8 the next morning. My mother Vivica had always treated social media as her personal congregation, a captive audience for her carefully curated life. I sat at my sleek glass desk watching the notifications roll in on my secondary monitor. The Facebook post was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, a staggering work of fiction designed to destroy my character before I could even defend myself. It featured a photograph of the two of us from several years ago, a rare moment where I was forced to smile next to her at some charity gala. The caption was a sprawling essay of manufactured maternal grief. She wrote about the heavy burden of watching a child lose their way in the modern world. She claimed that the intense pressures of running a tech company had finally broken my mind and that I was experiencing a severe mental breakdown. She told her hundreds of followers that, out of sudden, unprovoked paranoia, I was lashing out at the very people who had sacrificed everything for my success. She painted a picture of an elderly couple terrified for their daughter's sanity suffering in silence as she financially abused them out of nowhere. She explicitly asked for prayers and demanded privacy while her family dealt with this sudden tragic illness. It was brilliant in its cruelty. By framing me as mentally unstable, she instantly invalidated any truth I might try to share. If I spoke out about the financial abuse she inflicted on me, it would just look like the paranoid ramblings of a sick woman losing her grip on reality. I clicked on the comment section, watching the responses flood in real time. My phone began to vibrate constantly across the surface of my desk. The post acted as a bat signal for the flying monkeys of our extended network. Cousins who had not spoken to me in years were leaving tearful emojis and offering to bring casseroles to my parents' house. Women from her elite social clubs were praising her strength in the face of such a tragic family trial. The narrative was completely set, and the loyal foot soldiers were marching to war on her behalf. I did not answer the phone. I simply opened my secure audio software and routed all incoming calls directly to a digital evidence folder, setting it to automatically transcribe the voicemails. The first to leave a message was Aunt Sharon, my mother's older sister, and the self-appointed enforcer of family loyalty. Her voice came through the speaker dripping with condescension and absolute outrage. She said she had seen the Facebook post and was utterly disgusted by my behavior. She listed all the imaginary sacrifices my parents had made, claiming I owed them my very existence. She said abandoning your parents in their old age is a sin that cannot be washed away. She demanded I call my mother immediately to beg for forgiveness before the entire family officially turned their backs on me forever. She ended the message by telling me that professional success meant nothing if I was rotting on the inside. I saved the audio file, labeling it with her name and the exact timestamp. 30 minutes later, Reverend Thomas from my father's church left a voicemail. His tone was the classic booming disappointment of a man used to unquestioned authority over his congregation. He spoke slowly about the biblical commandment to honor thy father and mother. He suggested that my sudden financial success had allowed the devil to enter my heart, making me arrogant, greedy, and blind to the people who raised me. He offered to mediate a private counseling session at the church to help me find my way back to the Lord and my familial duties. The sheer hypocrisy of his words was almost amusing. This was the same man who gladly accepted the massive tithes I had secretly paid on my father's behalf for the last 3 years, just so Reginald could maintain his elite status as a pillar of the community and secure his front row seat every Sunday. I saved that file too, building a digital fortress of their manipulation. The folder grew larger by the hour, containing messages from uncles, cousins, and family friends, all echoing the exact same script my mother had written for them. The ultimate call came around noon. The caller ID displayed Jamal's name. Unlike the others, I decided to answer this one. I wanted to hear the exact sound of his desperation. I pressed the speaker button, leaning back in my leather chair, crossing my arms. The connection clicked open, and his voice filled the office, trying desperately to project the alpha male authority he had always used to intimidate me. He did not ask how I was. He immediately told me I was embarrassing myself and dragging the entire family name through the mud. He said Mom was in tears in the living room and Dad was pacing the halls because of my pathetic little stunt with the credit cards. He tried to play the role of the reasonable older brother coming to talk sense into his unhinged sister. He told me that locking the cards was a cute trick, but the joke was officially over. He said the investors for his app were getting impatient, and he needed the seed money transferred to his business account by Friday afternoon. He warned me that I was playing a dangerous game and that I did not understand the kind of pressure he was under. When I remained completely silent, letting his words hang in the empty air, his voice grew colder, dropping the concerned brother act entirely. He laid out his ultimatum. He said, if the $150,000 was not in his account by Friday, Dad was going to officially strip me of the family name. He said they would release a public statement distancing themselves from me and my business, effectively destroying my reputation in the Black corporate community across Atlanta. He said I would be cut off, isolated, and left with nothing but my computers and my secret boyfriend Dion, who Jamal claimed was probably the one brainwashing me into this rebellion. He finished by telling me to stop acting like a stubborn child, open the accounts back up, and wire the money before I ruined my own life permanently. I let his heavy breathing echo through the speaker for a few long seconds. I did not argue with his delusions. I did not explain myself or try to defend my sanity against his accusations. I simply ended the call mid-sentence, cutting off his empty threats with a single tap of my finger. I exported the call recording and added it to the evidence folder. The proof of extortion was now crystal clear, sitting right next to the proof of their financial dependence on me. I felt a deep, profound calm settle over my body. The worst thing they could threaten me with was removing me from the family, and that was the exact thing I had already decided to do myself. I turned my attention back to the massive codebase on my primary monitor, pushing the family drama out of my mind to focus on my actual work. The afternoon passed quietly. The soft clicking of my keyboard was the only sound in the office, but the ambient silence was suddenly shattered by a piercing electronic chime. The security dashboard on my third monitor flashed a bright crimson warning. Someone was attempting a brute force cyber attack on the primary administrative portals of my company's servers. The attack was not particularly sophisticated, but it was aggressive, trying thousands of password combinations per minute against the login gateways that controlled my corporate banking routing protocols and client databases. As a cybersecurity expert, I had built the company defenses to withstand military-grade assaults, so this clumsy attempt was like watching a toddler throw pebbles at a bank vault. The automated defense protocols were already black-holing the incoming traffic, locking out the corrupted connection requests before they could even reach the secondary firewall. But it was the origin of the attack that caught my full attention. I paused my workflow and ran a manual trace protocol, peeling back the amateur proxy layers the attacker was using to hide their location. The digital breadcrumbs bounced through a few cheap virtual private networks, meant to obscure the source before resolving to a static internet protocol address. I pulled up the registry for that specific address and stared at the results on the screen. The location mapped directly to a luxury downtown apartment complex. It was the exact complex where I paid the monthly lease for Jamal and Brittany. The reality of the situation washed over me, settling into a cold, hard truth. Jamal was not just a lazy grifter anymore. In his desperate panic to secure the $150,000 before his imaginary investors realized he was a fraud, he had escalated from familial manipulation to launching a targeted cyber attack against a secured corporate entity. He had officially crossed the line from a toxic sibling into a federal criminal. I leaned back in my chair, watching the failed login attempts stack up on the monitor in real time. A slow, quiet smile spread across my face. They thought they were playing a game of family politics. They thought this was about respect and submission and maintaining the social order of the Sunday dinner table. They had no idea they had just handed me the keys to their complete destruction. The trap was snapping shut faster than I had ever anticipated. Under federal law, unauthorized access to a protected computer system was a severe offense carrying massive prison time. Jamal had just documented his own crime on my servers. I picked up my phone and dialed Dion's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice steady and professional. I told him exactly what was happening on my monitors. I explained the brute force attack, the network trace, and the direct connection to Jamal's apartment. Dion was quiet for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the situation. As a corporate attorney, he knew exactly what this meant. He told me to secure every log file, every ping, and every trace route. He said we needed to build an airtight chain of custody for the digital evidence, because when the federal authorities eventually got involved, they would need unquestionable proof that the attack originated from Jamal's devices. I spent the next 2 hours running background processes to package the attack data into encrypted files. I watched as Jamal's desperate attempts finally ceased, probably because Brittany needed the internet bandwidth to post her own tearful videos on social media, defending my mother's narrative. The sheer incompetence of my family was staggering. They believed they could bully me into submission using Facebook posts and amateur hacking tools, while I was actively building a federal case against them. I saved the final encrypted folder and backed it up to a secure offline server. My phone continued to fill up with voicemails from relatives I had not seen since childhood, all eager to perform their loyalty to my mother by condemning me. I let them talk. Every harsh word, every empty threat, every manipulative plea was just another brick in the wall I was building between us. They had spent my entire life making me feel small and insignificant, but sitting in my office surrounded by the empire I had built with my own hands, I had never felt larger. They had completely underestimated the woman they had created. The very next morning, the fallout from my digital barricade arrived right at my front door, or rather the front glass doors of my corporate headquarters. I was sitting at my desk reviewing the encrypted logs of Jamal's pathetic cyber attack when my intercom buzzed. My assistant sounded panicked. She told me that my brother and his wife had just bypassed the lobby security by tailgating a delivery courier and were currently screaming at the receptionist demanding to speak directly to my chief financial officer. They did not even ask for me. They went straight for the money. I did not panic. I simply pressed the button on my intercom and told my assistant to let them through and to call Dion from the legal department, asking him to join me in my office. I folded my hands on the glass surface of my desk and waited. Less than a minute later, my office door was practically kicked open. Jamal marched in wearing a cheap suit that he probably thought made him look like a powerful executive. Brittany was right behind him, carrying a large designer tote bag and wearing a smug, triumphant smirk that made my blood boil. They did not sit down. They stood over my desk, trying to use their physical presence to intimidate me. Jamal did not say hello. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a thick, folded legal document, and slammed it down onto the glass right in front of me. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet office. He leaned forward, resting his knuckles on my desk, looking at me with pure venom. He told me the games were officially over and that he was taking control of the company. I looked down at the document without touching it. The header across the top page read, "Durable Power of Attorney." I felt a brief flash of confusion before the pieces clicked into place. I leaned closer, reading the visible paragraphs. It was a legal authorization granting full, unconditional control of my personal and business assets to my father, Reginald. But the date at the bottom of the page caught my eye. It was dated 5 years ago. My mind raced back to that specific time in my life. 5 years ago, I had collapsed from severe exhaustion and dehydration after working 18-hour days to secure my first major government contract. I had been hospitalized for nearly a week, drifting in and out of consciousness, hooked up to IV bags. My parents had visited me in the hospital not to offer comfort, but to complain about the inconvenience. I realized with chilling clarity what had happened. While I was lying in a hospital bed, heavily medicated and barely aware of my surroundings, my father had forged my signature on a comprehensive power of attorney document. He had kept it hidden in his safe all these years, a secret weapon waiting to be deployed the moment I stopped being a compliant financial source. Jamal saw me looking at the date, and his smirk widened into a malicious grin. He said, "Dad finally decided it was time to step in and protect me from my own mental instability." He referenced my mother's unhinged Facebook post, claiming that my recent erratic behavior and sudden financial abuse of the family proved I was no longer of sound mind. He said Reginald had officially activated the power of attorney that morning and had immediately executed a secondary transfer of authority, granting Jamal full executive control over my accounts, my assets, and my company. Brittany stepped forward, placing her designer bag on one of my expensive leather guest chairs. She looked around my spacious corner office, taking in the panoramic views of the city skyline and the sleek modern furniture. She crossed her arms and looked down at me with absolute contempt. She told me to start packing my things. She said Jamal was taking over the CEO suite immediately because the company needed a real man to run it anyway. She demanded I hand over the master passwords to the banking portals and the administrative servers before security escorted me out of the building. She even had the nerve to tell me she was going to redecorate the office because my taste was too sterile and depressing. The sheer audacity of their delusion was almost breathtaking. They genuinely believed they had outsmarted me. They thought a 5-year-old forged document built on a foundation of lies and a fake medical narrative created on Facebook was enough to walk into a multi-million-dollar corporate headquarters and seize control like modern-day pirates. They expected me to break down crying to beg for mercy or to completely lose my temper and validate their claims that I was mentally unstable. I did none of those things. I did not even flinch. I simply sat back in my chair, remaining completely silent, and watched them perform their pathetic victory lap. I let them talk. I let Jamal threaten to fire my entire executive team if I did not comply immediately. I let Brittany list all the changes she was going to make to the company structure so it could fund Jamal's imaginary crypto application. Every word they spoke was just more evidence of their extortion and fraud. The silence stretched on, making them both increasingly uncomfortable. Jamal's confident posture began to waver slightly as he realized I was not reacting the way he had planned. He slapped his hand on the desk again, raising his voice, ordering me to open the laptop and initiate the transfers right now, before he called the police and had me arrested for corporate theft. Just as he finished his empty threat, the door to my office opened smoothly. Dion walked in wearing his impeccably tailored charcoal suit, carrying a thick, black legal binder. Dion was not just my lead corporate attorney, he was also the man I loved. The partner who knew every dark secret my family had tried to bury. He had been listening to the entire exchange through the internal intercom system I had left open. Dion walked up to my desk, picking up the forged power of attorney document with his thumb and index finger, as if it were a piece of trash. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the text and the forged signature at the bottom. The room was dead silent. Jamal puffed out his chest, trying to look imposing, but standing next to Dion, he just looked like a desperate man playing dress-up. Dion finished reading the document, and then something happened that completely shattered the tension in the room. Dion burst out laughing. It was not a polite professional chuckle. It was a deep, genuine laugh of pure amusement that echoed off the glass walls. He tossed the forged document back onto my desk, shaking his head. Jamal's face turned a dangerous shade of red, his anger flaring at being openly mocked. He stepped toward Dion, demanding to know what was so funny and threatening to fire him on the spot as his first act as the new CEO. Dion did not stop smiling. He looked at Jamal with an expression of profound pity. He gently placed the thick black legal binder he had been carrying directly on top of the forged power of attorney, completely burying it. He tapped the cover of the binder twice with his finger. The silence in my office was heavy with the weight of what we had just uncovered. I looked at the blueprints for their destruction glowing on my monitors and felt a profound sense of clarity. Dion leaned back in his chair, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. He told me that we needed to review the exact legal timeline of what Jamal had just triggered by walking into this building. Dion explained the brutal legal reality of the forged power of attorney. He said that presenting a fraudulent legal document was one thing, but carrying it across state lines into a corporate headquarters to seize commercial assets elevated the crime to a completely different stratosphere. It was no longer a simple family dispute over money. It was a federal felony. Wire fraud, attempted corporate extortion, and identity theft all wrapped into one arrogant mistake. Jamal had walked into a trap of his own making, blinded by greed and the false confidence my parents had pumped into him his entire life. I thought back to the day 2 years ago, when I first sat in Dion's office and realized my family was bleeding me dry. We had spent months quietly transferring every share of my company, every piece of real estate, and every liquid asset into an ironclad blind trust. I had essentially turned myself into a ghost on paper. The legal entity that Jamal thought he was attacking simply did not exist anymore. The trust owned everything, and it was managed by independent fiduciaries who answered only to the strictest legal protocols. Jamal had brought a weapon to a battle against a phantom. He was trying to rob an empty vault using a map that was 5 years out of date. Dion opened his laptop and brought up a series of confirmation emails from our financial compliance team. He told me that while Jamal was screaming in my office earlier, trying to look like a ruthless executive, he had already triggered the emergency protocols we established with our corporate banking partners. The bank's fraud department had been fully briefed the moment Jamal presented the document to the lobby receptionist. They had placed a hard freeze on any external attempts to leverage my personal information and flagged Jamal's specific legal documents as known fraudulent materials. The authorities were already being looped in on the banking side. Jamal thought he was playing checkers, but Dion and I had finished a game of chess before he even walked through the door. We pulled up the security camera feeds from the lobby and the underground parking garage to track their exit. We watched the silent, high-definition footage of my brother and his wife fleeing the building. Brittany was stumbling in her designer heels, pushing past the security turnstiles, and looking over her shoulder as if the police were already chasing her. Her heavy leather tote bag kept slipping off her shoulders, spilling her expensive makeup onto the polished marble floor. Jamal was practically running, his face pale and slick with sweat. We watched him drop his keys twice, trying to unlock his luxury leased car. The arrogance that had filled my office just an hour ago was completely gone. It was replaced by the raw, primal terror of a man who realized he had just walked blindly into a federal trap. Dion pointed at the screen, watching their car speed out of the garage and swerve recklessly into downtown traffic. He said desperate men do not just surrender when they are cornered. He said Jamal was going to panic, and when he panicked, he would make even bigger mistakes. He needed massive amounts of cash to cover his tracks, to pay for lawyers, and to keep up the lifestyle Brittany demanded. That meant we needed to look much closer at the one thing he claimed was going to make him a billionaire. We needed to dismantle his cryptocurrency application. I turned back to my primary workstation and opened my advanced diagnostic tools. If Jamal was running a tech startup, I was going to tear its digital architecture apart piece by piece. I pulled the public registration files for his application. It was heavily marketed on social media, promising massive guaranteed returns for early investors. The branding was slick and professional, clearly designed to target working-class families in our community who were looking for a quick path to generational wealth. My father had likely used his influence as a former politician and church leader to convince vulnerable people to trust his son's visionary genius. I ran a deep trace on the application's hosting servers, bypassing their basic security measures with ease. For a supposedly revolutionary financial platform, the back-end infrastructure was shockingly cheap. It was hosted on a basic shared server cluster with virtually no encryption protocols to protect user data. I downloaded the source code for the public-facing interface and began to read through the lines of programming. It took me less than 20 minutes to realize the entire application was a hollow shell. There was no blockchain integration. There was no proprietary trading algorithm. There was no artificial intelligence predicting market trends like Jamal had boasted at Sunday dinner. There was just a flashy user interface connected to a standard third-party payment processing gateway. The scam was breathtaking in its simplicity and its cruelty. It was not a technology company at all. It was a digital collection bucket. The money users deposited into the app did not go into a cryptocurrency exchange to be invested. It went directly into a series of limited liability companies registered in the state of Delaware. I used my corporate access tools to pull the public filing records for those shell companies crossing the state databases to find the true beneficiaries. The registered agent for every single one of those dummy corporations was Jamal. I showed the routing data to Dion. He leaned forward, tracing the flow of money with his finger against the glass screen. His expression turned grim as the legal reality of the financial structure became clear. He explained that this was a textbook Ponzi scheme, structured to look like modern tech investment. Jamal was taking money from new investors to pay small temporary returns to the early adopters, creating the false illusion of a highly profitable platform. This tactic encouraged people to invest their life savings, believing they had found a gold mine. But the vast majority of the incoming cash was being siphoned off directly into his personal checking accounts. It was financial predation of the absolute worst kind, masked as black empowerment and technological innovation. I dug deeper into the bank routing numbers connected to the shell companies, following the digital trail of the stolen money. The outgoing transfers painted a sickening picture of their daily lifestyle. Tens of thousands of dollars had been transferred to luxury car dealerships, high-end jewelry boutiques, and exclusive travel agencies over the past 6 months. There were massive charges for private table service at downtown nightclubs and endless transactions at the country club where Brittany spent her afternoons. While my parents were standing at the pulpit, telling everyone at church that Jamal was a struggling genius who just needed community support, he and his wife were living like royalty on stolen money. Brittany had been buying her designer bags and hosting her lavish teas using the retirement funds and college savings of innocent people who believed in her husband's lies. I sat back in my chair and let the sheer scale of the deception wash over me. My family had always been toxic and emotionally abusive, but this was a completely new level of depravity. My father had taught us from a young age that appearances were more important than truth, but he had also preached about integrity and community uplift from the pulpit. To see his golden child actively stealing from the very community that trusted them just to fund a lifestyle of fake luxury was physically repulsive. And the fact that my parents were likely aware of the sudden influx of cash, or at least willfully ignorant of its true source, made them fully complicit in the crime. They had allowed their greed and their desperate need for status to blind them to the fact that their son was a predator. Dion placed his hand over mine, grounding me in the present moment. He could see the disgust and the exhaustion setting into my posture. He told me quietly that I could not carry the guilt of their actions. He said that for years I had tried to save them from themselves by writing checks, paying their overdue bills, and fixing their legal mistakes. But all I had done was fund their delusion and delay the inevitable. He said the blind trust had not just protected my personal assets, it had finally forced them to face the consequences of their own destructive choices. Without my money acting as a buffer, the rot at the center of their lives was now fully exposed to the light. We mapped out the full scope of the federal violations on a secure digital whiteboard. Wire fraud for the fake application soliciting funds across state lines. Bank fraud for the forged power of attorney presented at my corporate office. tax evasion for the unreported offshore transfers Brittany was making to hide the stolen cash, money laundering for washing the investor funds through the Delaware shell companies. The list of felonies was long enough to put Jamal away for decades. Dion started drafting a comprehensive brief, compiling the digital evidence, the financial transaction logs, the server source code, and the security footage from my office lobby. He said we were not just going to hand this over to local law enforcement, who might be swayed by my father's political connections. This was a massive interstate crime. This was a case for the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. We knew the clock was ticking down to zero. Jamal and Brittany were currently scrambling out there in the city, probably trying to drain whatever funds were left in their shell companies before the banking authorities fully locked them out. They were desperate animals caught in a trap, and they would try to salvage whatever cash they could carry. My mother was likely still sitting in her pristine living room organizing her smear campaign on social media, responding to comments from her flying monkeys, completely unaware that her golden son was about to become the primary target of a federal manhunt. And my father was probably making panicked phone calls, trying to figure out how to leverage his old political connections to save his own reputation before the scandal broke. They had spent my entire life telling me I was the disappointment, the one who needed to be fixed, the one who could be easily replaced. They had built their entire identity on the lie that they were superior and untouchable. But as I looked at the compiled evidence file sitting on my desktop, a digital bomb waiting to be dropped on their perfect facade, I knew that their reign of terror was finally over. Jamal was not going to stop. His desperation would push him to try one last reckless move to secure the funds he needed to escape the country or pay off his angry investors. Dion and I prepared to track his every digital movement, waiting for the exact moment he would seal his own fate. We were not going to interrupt him. We were going to let him dig his own grave so deep that neither my father nor his powerful friends could ever pull him out. The glow of the multiple monitors illuminated the dark office as evening turned into night. Dion ordered food that neither of us touched. The coffee grew cold on my desk, but my mind was running hotter and faster than the servers processing the data in front of me. We had already established that Jamal's application was a hollow shell designed to siphon money from innocent people. But finding the shell companies was just scratching the surface of a much deeper rot. To build an airtight federal case, we needed to map every single branch of their financial deception. I cracked my knuckles and opened a series of specialized diagnostic programs. I needed to know exactly how they were washing the money because stupid people with sudden wealth always leave a trail of breadcrumbs. I started by isolating the outbound transfer logs from the Delaware limited liability companies. Jamal was arrogant, but he was also lazy. He had not bothered to use complex tumbling algorithms to hide the flow of cash. He simply bounced the money through a few domestic holding accounts before funneling it out. But as I traced the destination routing numbers, the pattern suddenly shifted. The domestic trail went cold, and the money disappeared into an international wire network. I leaned closer to the screen, typing rapid commands to bypass the standard banking firewalls and access the international SWIFT codes. The transfer destinations were not regular business accounts. They were offshore private wealth accounts located in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. I asked Dion to pull the registration data for the offshore routing numbers. He worked quietly beside me, his legal expertise perfectly complementing my technical intrusion. It took him less than 10 minutes to find the common denominator linking all the offshore accounts. The registered beneficiary was not Jamal. The primary account holder for every single offshore entity was Brittany. The realization was a sharp slap of clarity. Brittany was not just a clueless, spoiled wife spending her husband's money. She was the primary money launderer. She was actively moving the stolen investor funds across international borders to hide them from the Internal Revenue Service and domestic authorities. I watched the transaction logs scroll down my screen, painting a vivid picture of her staggering greed. There were wire transfers for $50,000, marked as consulting fees that went straight into private accounts, used exclusively for high-end luxury purchases. We saw the exact dates she transferred stolen money to buy her limited edition Birkin bags, her diamond tennis bracelets, and her custom imported shoes. While my mother was crying on Facebook about how hard my brother was working, Brittany was sitting at her country club, sipping champagne and routing the life savings of vulnerable families into her offshore shopping funds. The audacity was sickening, but the digital evidence was a gift. By moving the money internationally, Brittany had just upgraded their local scam into a massive federal money laundering conspiracy. She had tied her own noose with designer silk. I downloaded every single routing number, every wire confirmation, and every offshore account balance. The evidence file was growing into a weapon of mass destruction. But as I compiled the data from the bank that held Jamal's primary business account, a strange anomaly caught my eye. The initial capital used to open the fraudulent business accounts did not come from early investors. The ledger showed a massive initial deposit of $2 million flagged as a commercial business loan. I paused my workflow staring at the screen. Jamal had absolutely zero credit history and a documented string of bankruptcies. No legitimate bank on the planet would approve him for a $2 million commercial loan without massive collateral and an immaculate guarantor. I asked Dion to look at the loan origination file. His brow furrowed as he read the screen. He told me the loan was secured through a prominent local bank, a bank where my father, Reginald, happened to have deep political connections from his days in office. Dion said the only way a bank underwrites a loan of that magnitude for a shell company is if there is an unshakable corporate guarantor backing the debt. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. A cold, heavy sense of dread pooled in my stomach. I knew exactly who the only unshakable corporate guarantor in our family was. I opened a new secure terminal and logged directly into my personal and corporate identity monitoring services. As a cybersecurity executive, I had locked down my own credit profiles with maximum security alerts, but I had never thought to check the historical archives from 5 years ago before I built my current infrastructure. I initiated a deep sweep of my personal social security number and my corporate tax identification numbers. The progress bar loaded slowly, agonizingly, taking seconds that felt like hours. When the report finally populated on the screen, all the breath left my lungs. There, it was buried under layers of corporate obfuscation. A $2 million commercial loan approved and dispersed 18 months ago. The primary applicant was Jamal's shell company. But the absolute guarantor, the person legally responsible for every single cent of that massive debt, was me. I clicked on the scanned image of the original loan application. My father, Reginald, had signed as the character reference, and the primary facilitator using his political weight to push the paperwork through the local branch. But the signature on the guarantor line was a flawless forgery of my own handwriting. They had not just used my name. They had used my social security number, my corporate tax details, and my immaculate credit history to secure the bag of cash they needed to start their fake empire. The forged power of attorney we saw earlier today was not a new trick. They had been using my stolen identity for over a year. I sat completely frozen, staring at the digital signatures of the people who raised me. The room felt like it was spinning. This was not just financial abuse anymore. This was not just a greedy family asking for handouts or living rent-free in a house I owned. This was a premeditated, calculated assassination of my future. Dion read the loan documents over my shoulder. I could hear his breathing hitch as he realized the full scope of what they had done. He placed a steady hand on my shoulder, his voice low and tense. He explained the horrific legal reality of this specific loan structure. If Jamal's application collapsed, which it was already doing, the bank would not go after him. He had no assets in his name. The bank would come directly for me. They would seize my company, my properties, and my personal accounts to satisfy the $2 million debt. And because the funds were tied to a fraudulent Ponzi scheme, the federal investigators would follow the money straight to the guarantor. My parents had deliberately structured the entire scam so that when it inevitably failed, I would be the one holding the bag. The betrayal was so absolute, so deeply evil, that it transcended anger. They had smiled at me at Sunday dinners. My mother had bragged about family loyalty. My father had demanded my respect and obedience. And the entire time they were looking at me, they knew they had tied a $2 million anchor around my neck and pushed me into the deep end. They had intended for me to take the fall for a federal crime. They were entirely willing to let their daughter go to federal prison and lose the empire she built from scratch, just so Jamal could play pretend businessman and Brittany could buy her offshore luxury goods. I looked at the screen, watching the cursor blink at the end of the forged document. For 32 years, I had carried the weight of being the family disappointment. I had internalized their criticism, believing that if I just worked harder, provided more, and stayed out of the way, I would eventually earn my place at their table. I had paid their bills, bought their cars, and swallowed my pride to maintain the illusion of a family. But looking at the stolen Social Security number on that screen, the last lingering shred of my daughterly obligation burned away into nothing but ash. I turned to Dion, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or hesitation. I told him to start drafting the final legal packages. I told him to compile the identity theft reports, the forged loan documents, the offshore laundering trails, and the Ponzi scheme code. I was no longer playing defense. I was no longer trying to protect myself by hiding my assets in a blind trust. They wanted to use my name to build an empire of fraud, so I was going to use my name to tear their entire world down to the studs. I opened a direct encrypted channel to a contact I had at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a senior cybercrimes agent I had consulted for on previous corporate security cases. I did not type a vague inquiry. I sent a highly classified preliminary brief outlining a multi-million-dollar interstate wire fraud and identity theft ring operating out of Atlanta. I attached the initial routing numbers and the forged loan documents. The response came back within 5 minutes, confirming receipt and initiating an emergency case file. The gloves were officially off. My father had looked me in the eyes and told me I was replaceable. My mother had gone on the internet to tell the world I was insane. My brother had marched into my office to steal my company, and my sister-in-law had laughed while washing stolen money through island banks. They had dug a $2 million grave and put my name on the headstone. But they had severely underestimated the architect they were trying to bury. I closed the server logs and stood up from my desk, looking out at the city lights. They thought they were the predators in this story, but they were about to learn that they had walked directly into the den of a monster they created. The real hunt had just begun. The wheels of federal justice grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. For the next 14 days, Dion and I operated in a state of absolute, calculated silence. We handed over every digital trace, every forged signature, and every offshore routing number to the Federal Cybercrimes Division. The agents instructed us to maintain total radio silence while they built an airtight indictment. They needed Jamal and my father to feel safe enough to keep operating their scheme, because every new transaction they made added another nail to their federal coffins. While the agents built their case, my family was suffocating under the weight of their own manufactured reality. Without the constant flow of my money to prop up their illusions, their daily lives were rapidly collapsing. Informants within my corporate network told me that Jamal was sweating through his cheap suits, making panicked calls to anyone who would listen, begging for short-term bridge loans. Brittany had been quietly trying to sell her designer handbags on luxury resale websites just to keep the lights on in their downtown apartment. My mother's social media posts became increasingly frantic, shifting from aggressive attacks against my mental health to vague, desperate pleas about the devil attacking her family's finances. But narcissistic pride is a dangerous disease, and my parents were terminal. Instead of humbling themselves or stopping the fraud, they decided to double down on their elite facade. If they were going down, they were going to do it while drinking champagne. Through my monitoring of their public digital footprints, I discovered their ultimate Hail Mary play. Reginald and Vivica were organizing a massive black-tie charity gala to be held at the Ritz-Carlton Ballroom downtown. The event was heavily advertised across all their elite social networks, alumni associations, and church groups. The gala was supposedly a philanthropic fundraiser for urban technological development, aiming to uplift young Black entrepreneurs in Atlanta. The marketing materials were sickeningly brilliant. They were using the language of community empowerment to mask a desperate cash grab. The entire event was nothing but a high society trap designed to funnel hundreds of thousands of dollars from wealthy politicians, church leaders, and local socialites directly into Jamal's fake cryptocurrency application. They were planning to scam the entire city's elite in one night and use the stolen charity funds to pay off their mounting debts and flee the consequences. They had invited the mayor, several city council members, and the most prominent pastors in the state. To ensure their narrative remained completely unchallenged, they had specifically banned me from the premises. My mother had personally delivered a photograph of my face to the Ritz-Carlton security team, labeling me as an estranged, mentally unstable family member who posed a physical threat to the event. She explicitly instructed the hotel staff that if I showed up, I was to be removed by force or arrested for trespassing. They thought they had completely outmaneuvered me, locking me out of their social circle while they robbed our community blind. They had no idea they were playing checkers against a grandmaster who already owned the board. Dean and I sat in my office pulling the corporate registration files for the gala. Hosting a massive event at the Ritz-Carlton requires immense upfront capital. Capital that I knew for a fact my family did not possess. Dion traced the financial backing, and we discovered the weak link in their armor. Jamal had managed to secure the initial deposit for the ballroom by draining the last remaining funds from his early victims, but the final payment for the catering, the staff, and the venue rental was due 48 hours before the event. The final invoice was a staggering $90,000, and Jamal's payment had bounced 3 times in a row. The hotel management had threatened to cancel the gala entirely, leaving my family to face absolute social ruin. In a desperate panic, Jamal had reached out to a regional investment bank, begging them to act as the primary corporate sponsor for the night, promising them massive returns on his fake application in exchange for covering the hotel invoice. I looked at Dion, and we shared a cold, knowing smile. We did not even need to hack anything. We just needed to use the power of the blind trust. Dion contacted the regional investment bank, representing himself as the lead counsel for an anonymous private equity firm. He made them an offer they could not refuse. My blind trust completely bought out the investment bank's sponsorship rights for the gala at a premium. We legally acquired the title of primary corporate sponsor, but we did not stop there. Dion reached out directly to the general manager of the Ritz-Carlton. Acting on behalf of the new primary sponsor, he paid the $90,000 final invoice in cash, clearing Jamal's bounced checks. As a standard condition of paying the final massive balance, Dion transferred the legal contract for the ballroom rental out of my father's name and directly into the name of my corporate trust. The hotel management, caring only about their bottom line, processed the paperwork without a second thought. Reginald and Vivica were so consumed with selling their fake wealth on social media that they never bothered to check the updated vendor contracts. They assumed their investment bank sponsor had simply handled the bill. The night of the gala arrived heavy with the humid heat of an Atlanta summer. Dion and I sat in the back of a luxury armored SUV parked 3 blocks away from the Ritz-Carlton. I was not wearing a business suit tonight. I was dressed for a highly public execution. I wore a custom-tailored emerald green silk gown that cascaded down my silhouette, looking like a walking embodiment of the wealth my family was pretending to have. My hair was pulled back into a flawless, sleek style, and my jewelry was subtle but undeniably expensive. Dion sat beside me, looking like a lethal corporate weapon in a perfectly fitted black tuxedo. We monitored the situation inside the ballroom through a discreet live feed provided by one of my corporate security team members who had infiltrated the event staff. The scene inside was a masterclass in grand deception. The ballroom was dripping in opulence. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over 50 round tables draped in black velvet. Towering centerpieces of white orchids and gold leaf dominated the room. A live jazz band played softly in the corner. My family was working the room with desperate manic energy. Reginald was holding court near the open bar, gripping a glass of premium bourbon, laughing loudly with a group of city councilmen, playing the role of the benevolent patriarch. Vivica was gliding between tables of her sorority sisters, wearing a glittering gown that she likely purchased with stolen funds, accepting praise and sympathy for her imaginary struggles. Jamal and Brittany were circling the wealthiest guests in the room, holding sleek digital tablets, aggressively pitching their fake application and securing massive charity donations that were routing straight into their offshore accounts. They looked so happy, so completely secure in their untouchable arrogance. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully discarded the replaceable daughter and secured their financial future through fraud. I signaled to my lead security director. The armored SUV pulled away from the curb and glided smoothly up to the grand entrance of the Ritz-Carlton. The valet opened my door and I stepped out onto the pristine pavement, the emerald silk of my dress pooling around my heels. Dion stepped out beside me, adjusting his cufflinks. Behind us, 2 SUVs emptied, releasing 4 highly trained private security contractors dressed in immaculate black suits. They fell into a flawless diamond formation around us as we walked through the glass revolving doors of the hotel lobby. We bypassed the registration tables entirely. The volunteers working the guest list tried to stop us, but my security detail smoothly and wordlessly moved them aside, creating an unobstructed path directly to the grand ballroom doors. The heavy oak doors were closed, muffling the sound of the jazz band and the clinking glasses inside. I placed my hands flat against the polished wood, took one deep, steadying breath, and pushed the doors wide open. My entrance was perfectly timed. Reginald had just stepped up to the main stage, tapping the microphone to get the crowd's attention for his keynote fundraising speech. The sudden loud opening of the heavy doors drew the eyes of every single person in the massive room. The jazz band faltered and stopped playing. The dull roar of 500 wealthy guests chatting and laughing died down into a sudden absolute silence. I stood in the threshold, flanked by towering security contractors, looking like a queen arriving to reclaim her stolen throne. I locked eyes with my father across the expanse of the ballroom. His confident political smile melted off his face, instantly replaced by an expression of pure, unfiltered terror. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned white. Vivica, who had been standing near the front row of tables, let out a sharp, audible gasp, dropping her crystal champagne flute. The glass shattered against the marble floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. Brittany grabbed Jamal's arm, digging her nails into his tuxedo jacket, her eyes wide with panic as she recognized the private security team surrounding me. I did not wait for an invitation. I stepped down into the ballroom, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. The crowd parted for me automatically, sensing the dangerous shift in the atmosphere. Powerful politicians and wealthy socialites stepped back, murmuring to each other, confused by the sudden tension radiating from the host family. Reginald recovered from his initial shock, his deep-seated arrogance overriding his fear. He leaned into the microphone, his voice booming through the ballroom speakers, attempting to weaponize his authority. He told the crowd to please excuse the interruption, claiming that a deeply troubled and estranged family member had managed to breach security. He signaled frantically to the hotel staff standing along the walls, ordering them to remove the disturbed woman immediately. 4 hotel security guards began to move toward me, looking hesitant as they sized up my private detail. My contractors did not even flinch. They simply shifted their stance, creating an impenetrable wall between me and the approaching hotel staff. Reginald lost his temper, entirely dropping the benevolent pastor facade. He abandoned the podium and marched down the stage steps, pointing an angry, trembling finger directly at my face. He yelled at the hotel guards, demanding to know why they were not doing their jobs. He screamed that I was on a banned list, that I was trespassing on a private charity event, and that he wanted me arrested and dragged out in handcuffs right now. The guests were openly staring now, whispering furiously. The perfect illusion of the happy, successful Black family was shattering in real time right in front of their target investors. Before the hotel guards could reach my security perimeter, the general manager of the Ritz-Carlton pushed his way through the crowd. He was a tall, stern man in a tailored suit gripping a leather clipboard. He looked extremely stressed, wiping sweat from his forehead, as he stepped between my security detail and his own staff holding up a hand to stop the escalation. Reginald turned his fury on the manager, demanding to know why a banned trespasser was allowed to disrupt a $90,000 charity gala. He ordered the manager to call the police and have me physically removed before he sued the hotel for breach of contract. The general manager did not look at my father. He turned and looked directly at me, offering a deeply apologetic, respectful bow of his head. Then he turned back to Reginald, opening the leather clipboard. He spoke into the dead silence of the ballroom, his voice carrying clearly to the surrounding guests. He informed my father that hotel security would not be removing anyone. He explained in a very calm, clinical tone that the final payment for the ballroom rental had bounced 3 consecutive times, effectively nullifying Reginald's contract with the hotel. He stated that 48 hours ago, a private corporate trust had stepped in to pay the $90,000 balance in full, saving the event from cancellation. The manager flipped the page on his clipboard, showing my father the glowing ink of the new legal agreement. He told Reginald that the woman he was trying to throw out was the sole beneficiary of that corporate trust. He looked my father directly in the eyes and delivered the ultimate humiliating truth. He stated that Malika was not a trespasser and she was not a guest. According to the hotel records, she was the sole legal host and financial backer of the entire ballroom. She owned the venue for the night, and if anyone was going to be removed by security, it would be whoever she decided to kick out. My voice cut through the tension in the room, cold and commanding. I told the general manager that his staff was dismissed. I said I had hired my own security for the night and that the hotel personnel were no longer needed in my ballroom. The general manager bowed his head once more and signaled for the hotel guards to step back. They retreated to the perimeter, leaving Reginald standing alone at the bottom of the stage steps, completely isolated and stripped of his authority. The murmurs in the crowd escalated into a dull roar. Politicians were whispering frantically to their aides. Pastors were staring at my father with a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. The target investors who had just written massive checks to Jamal based on the illusion of our family wealth were suddenly looking very nervous. I walked slowly past my father, not even acknowledging his existence. I walked up the steps to the main stage, Dion right beside me. My security detail formed a semicircle at the base of the stage, effectively creating an impenetrable barrier between me and the rest of the room. I approached the podium where Reginald had just been delivering his lies. The microphone was still active. I looked out over the sea of faces adjusting the microphone stand. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not perform the angry Black woman stereotype they were desperately hoping for so they could write me off as unhinged. I spoke with the absolute precision of a CEO delivering a hostile takeover announcement. I welcomed the guests to the gala. I told them I was Malika, the sole financial sponsor of the evening, and the CEO of the cybersecurity firm that had single-handedly funded the illusion they were all currently looking at. The room fell so silent, you could hear the ice melting in the cocktail glasses. I told the crowd that my father had likely spent the first half of the evening talking about Black excellence, family unity, and the brilliance of his son, Jamal's new tech venture. I said it was a beautiful story, perfectly crafted to open their wallets and secure their political support. But unfortunately, it was entirely fiction. I gestured to the massive digital projection screens flanking the stage, which had previously been displaying the fake logos for Jamal's application. I pulled a sleek black remote control from my clutch. With a single click, the screens went dark. A moment later, a new file loaded. It was an audio waveform visualizing the secret recording I had made at the Sunday dinner table weeks ago. I pressed play. The pristine acoustics of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom projected my father's voice with crystal clarity. The guests heard Reginald's booming, angry voice echoing off the walls. They heard him demand $150,000. They heard my calm refusal. And then they heard the kill shot. The entire room listened as the revered former politician, the man who had just preached to them about family values, screamed at his daughter. "You are replaceable. Do not forget that. The only reason you have a seat at this table is because we allow it. Without us, you have absolutely nothing." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Vivica covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with terror as she realized the depth of the exposure. Brittany looked like she was going to be physically sick. Reginald stood frozen, his jaw slack, his political career evaporating into the humid Atlanta air in real time. I paused the audio. I leaned into the microphone. I told the crowd that my father was right about one thing. I was replaceable. But I decided to replace myself before he had the chance. And when I cut the financial cord, the truth about this highly successful self-made family came crashing down. I clicked the remote again. The screens shifted from the audio waveform to a series of high-resolution pie charts and financial ledgers. The data was beautifully visualized, impossible to misunderstand. I walked the crowd through the numbers with surgical detachment. I showed them the mortgage payments for the 6-bedroom estate Reginald claimed he built with his bare hands. The deed was clearly listed under my corporate trust. I showed them the autopay records for his Porsche Cayenne, highlighting the massive monthly withdrawals directly from my business accounts. Then I moved to my mother. Vivica tried to hide behind a group of her sorority sisters, but the crowd instinctively parted, leaving her exposed. I displayed the transaction logs for her elite social club dues, her charity gala sponsorships, and her designer wardrobes. The data proved that every single philanthropic donation she had ever made in the name of our family, every dollar she had used to buy her status in the church and the community, came directly from the daughter she was currently trying to have declared mentally incompetent. The whispers in the crowd turned into loud, angry conversations. The facade was completely shattered. The influential women who had admired Vivica were now looking at her with open disgust, realizing her entire persona was a parasite feeding off her own child. Finally, I turned my attention to the golden child. I put Jamal's face on the massive screens alongside Brittany's. I did not hold back. I displayed the transaction logs from the country club where Brittany had her card declined. I showed the bank statements, proving that Jamal had zero legitimate income and had bankrupted 3 consecutive businesses. The pie charts demonstrated how 80% of his previous business loans had been siphoned off to pay for Brittany's luxury vacations, her designer bags, and their downtown apartment lease, which I had been subsidizing for years. Jamal could not take it anymore. The humiliation of being exposed as a broke fraud in front of the city's elite broke his fragile ego. He pushed past his mother, his face contorted with rage, screaming that the documents were fake. He charged toward the stage, intending to physically attack me and rip the microphone from my hands. He never made it past the first step. 2 of my security contractors stepped forward, immediately intercepting him. They did not use excessive force, they simply caught him by the shoulders and effortlessly threw him backward. Jamal stumbled and fell hard onto the marble floor, his cheap tuxedo jacket tearing at the seam. Vivica lost what was left of her mind. She began screaming hysterically, demanding that the hotel staff cut the power to the ballroom. She yelled that I was a demon sent to destroy the family and begged the pastors in the room to stop the presentation. But no one moved to help her. The pastors were too busy staring at the screens, realizing the tithes they had accepted were funded by financial abuse. Dayon stepped forward, moving gracefully past me to stand at the edge of the stage. He looked down at Jamal, who was scrambling to his feet, panting heavily. Dion held up a thick, heavy manila folder. The room quieted down again, sensing that the corporate attorney was about to drop the final execution order. Dion tapped the folder against his palm, the sound sharp and ominous. He told Jamal and Reginald that the embarrassment they were feeling right now, the loss of their social status, and their fake wealth was nothing compared to what was coming next. He said the financial abuse and the petty grifting were just family drama, but that was not why we brought private security. Dion opened the folder, pulling out a stack of documents bearing federal seals. He looked out at the terrified faces of the investors, the people who had just written checks to Jamal's fake application. Dion told the room that we had not even gotten to the $2 million commercial loan yet. Dion stepped back, allowing the silence in the room to stretch until it felt like the walls were closing in on my family. He handed me the heavy manila folder, but I did not even bother to open it. The documents inside were already digitized and queued up on my presentation drive. I raised the small black remote control and pressed the button. The massive screens behind me flickered, and the pie charts of my mother's petty country club theft vanished. They were instantly replaced by stark black and white high-resolution scans of commercial banking documents. The logo of a prominent regional bank flashed across the top of the screens, the exact same bank whose senior vice presidents were currently sitting at table 4 near the front of the ballroom. I saw those executives physically stiffen in their chairs, their faces draining of color as they recognized their own internal loan origination forms being projected for 500 people to see. I leaned into the microphone, my voice dropping to a low clinical register that carried easily through the dead silent room. I told the audience that the superficial spending they had just seen my mother clutching her designer bags and my father driving his leased Porsche was nothing more than the daily maintenance of their fake lives. It was financial abuse, yes, but it was just family drama. What was on the screen behind me, however, was a federal crime. I directed the crowd's attention to the loan amount highlighted in bright yellow across the center of the documents. $2 million. A commercial business loan secured 18 months ago for Jamal's phantom technology startup. I looked down at my father, who was still standing at the bottom of the stage steps. His chest was heaving, his breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. He knew exactly what document I was displaying. I walked the crowd through the paperwork line by line, like a prosecutor presenting a murder weapon to a jury. I explained that Jamal had zero credit history and a string of bankruptcies attached to his name. I asked the wealthy investors in the room to consider how a man with no collateral and no working product secures a $2 million commercial loan. The answer, I told them, was identity theft. I clicked the remote, zooming in on the signature page of the loan document. The image magnified until the forged signatures were 10 feet tall on the screens behind me. I pointed to the primary guarantor line. There was my full legal name, my corporate tax identification number, and my highly secure personal social security number. I told the crowd that I had never seen this document until 2 weeks ago. My brother had stolen my identity to secure the massive bag of cash he needed to start his fake empire. But he did not do it alone. I clicked the remote again, highlighting the signature directly below mine. It was the signature of the primary facilitator, the character reference who used his political weight and church connections to push the fraudulent paperwork through the regional bank. The signature belonged to Reginald. The ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked gasps and angry whispers. The bank executives at table 4 were already on their phones, frantically typing messages to their legal and fraud departments. Reginald stumbled backward, gripping the back of an empty velvet chair to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. His entire political and religious legacy was burning to ash in front of the very people he had spent his life trying to impress. He had used his reputation as a man of God to co-sign a massive federal fraud using his own daughter's stolen identity as collateral to fund his golden child. But I was not finished. The $2 million loan was just the seed money used to set the trap. I turned my attention to the real victims in the room, the dozens of local doctors, lawyers, small business owners, and church members who had been personally invited to this gala because they had already handed over their savings to Jamal. I looked directly at a group of prominent pastors sitting near the center aisle who had proudly encouraged their congregations to invest in Jamal's application under the guise of supporting Black technological innovation and community wealth building. I clicked the remote, and the forged loan documents vanished, replaced by lines of raw server code and banking transfer logs. I told the investors that I had personally audited the source code of Jamal's revolutionary application. I did not use complex technical jargon. I explained it to them in brutal, simple terms. I said the application did not actually exist. There was no blockchain technology being developed. There was no artificial intelligence predicting the financial market. The application was nothing more than a digital collection bucket, a hollow user interface connected directly to a third-party payment processing gateway. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme built on smoke and mirrors. Several men in the audience stood up from their tables, their faces tight with sudden realization and rising panic. I clicked the remote again, tracking the exact flow of their hard-earned money. The screens displayed a complex network of limited liability companies all registered in the state of Delaware, all listing Jamal as the primary and sole registered agent. I showed them exactly how their investment deposits were being routed out of the application interface and directly into these shell companies. I told them that the small returns they had received early on to build their trust were just the deposits of newer victims being recycled to maintain the illusion of profitability. There was no actual product generating revenue. The murmurs in the crowd grew into loud, angry voices. People were realizing that the checks they had written to support a young visionary entrepreneur had actually been deposited straight into a black hole of greed. But I needed them to know exactly where the black hole led. I clicked the remote for the final sequence of financial destruction. The domestic shell companies disappeared from the screens, replaced by international wire transfer confirmations and offshore banking statements. The destination accounts were located in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. I walked to the edge of the stage, looking down at Brittany, who was desperately trying to shrink behind a tall floral centerpiece at the host table. I told the room that Jamal was far too incompetent to manage an international money laundering operation entirely by himself. He needed help washing the stolen funds across borders, so he enlisted his wife. I projected the registration details of the offshore accounts on the massive screens overhead. The primary beneficiary listed on every single offshore account was Brittany. I did not hold back a single detail. I displayed the itemized transaction logs from those offshore accounts, mapping the stolen investor money directly to her lavish, unearned lifestyle. I read the purchases aloud over the microphone, letting the exorbitant prices echo through the grand ballroom. A $50,000 wire transfer categorized as consulting fees that went directly to a luxury foreign car dealership. $20,000 routed to exclusive travel agencies for their tropical island vacations. $10,000 at a time withdrawn for private table service at downtown Atlanta nightclubs. I pointed directly at Brittany from the stage. I told the angry investors that their children's college funds and their retirement savings were not building a technology company for the future. Their money was currently hanging on her arm in the form of a limited edition designer handbag. Their money was sparkling on her wrist in the form of a diamond tennis bracelet. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted from stunned shock to pure, unadulterated hostility. This was no longer a charity gala. It was a lynch mob dressed in formal wear. The investors who had been scammed began shouting, their voices overlapping in a chaotic wave of raw fury. Men in tailored tuxedos were pointing at Jamal, demanding their money back. Right now, their faces flushed with rage. Women who had previously admired Brittany's style and attended her lavish tea parties were looking at her with absolute revulsion, realizing they had been drinking champagne bought with stolen community funds. The social ruin was total and immediate. I watched my mother Vivica try to grab the arm of a prominent local judge she had known for decades, pleading with him to listen to her, to believe her innocence. The judge physically recoiled, pulling his arm away violently, as if her touch was highly infectious. He turned his back on her without a word and walked rapidly toward the ballroom exit. The wealthy sorority sisters who had flooded her Facebook post with prayers and emotional support earlier in the week were now actively putting physical distance between themselves and my mother, stepping away from her table as if she were a walking biohazard. The smear campaign she had so carefully orchestrated against me had completely imploded. Every lie she told about my mental health, every fake tear she shed on social media was now exposed as a desperate, pathetic attempt to cover up a multi-million-dollar federal crime syndicate operating out of her own living room. Viveka collapsed into a velvet dining chair, burying her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically. There was no audience left to manipulate. Her social currency was completely bankrupt. Reginald was surrounded by angry investors, screaming in his face, demanding to know how a former politician and church leader could vouch for such an obvious scam. The man who had built his entire life on respectability and power was cowering, shivering like a cornered rat, unable to formulate a single coherent sentence to defend himself. His booming voice of authority was completely gone. Jamal was frozen in place, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. The private security contractors maintained their strict perimeter, ensuring he could not rush the stage, but they did not intervene in the crowd turning aggressively against him. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, surrounded by the very people he had robbed blind. But it was Brittany who finally broke. The reality of the offshore bank accounts being projected on the glowing screens had shattered her arrogant, entitled facade completely. She was not just a spoiled wife flaunting her wealth anymore. She was the primary suspect in an international money laundering operation. She knew the wealthy guests in the room were looking at her expensive jewelry and seeing their own stolen money. She saw the raw, unfiltered hatred in their eyes, and she realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that the federal government was going to bury her under a mountain of financial evidence. She was looking at decades in a federal prison, and she was definitely not built for loyalty. Brittany snapped, the preservation instinct of a parasite completely taking over her rational thought. She pushed her way through the angry crowd, shoving past the investors who were yelling at Jamal. She did not try to defend her husband. She did not stand by the man who had bought her the luxury life she demanded and felt she deserved. Instead, she scrambled toward the stage, her designer heels slipping dangerously on the polished marble floor. My security detail moved swiftly to block her access to the stairs, but she stopped at the bottom, looking up at me with wild, desperate eyes, her perfect makeup streaked with panicked tears. She did not beg me for mercy. She turned to the crowd of furious investors, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical scream that cut through the heavy shouting in the ballroom. She threw her hands up, pointing frantically at Jamal, who was standing just a few feet away, looking completely betrayed by her sudden movement. She screamed at the top of her lungs that she did not know anything about the fake application or the Ponzi scheme. She yelled that Jamal had forced her to open the offshore accounts, and that he had continuously lied to her about where the massive amounts of money were coming from. She pointed a shaking, manic finger at my brother, and her voice echoed across the grand ballroom, completely destroying whatever was left of their toxic marriage. She screamed that she was totally innocent, and that Jamal was the mastermind who had stolen his own sister's identity to secure the initial loan. She turned on her husband in a heartbeat, offering him up to the angry mob and the authorities to save her own skin, abandoning the family loyalty she had so proudly preached about at my dinner table just a few weeks ago. Brittany's shrill voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers bouncing against the velvet-draped walls of the ballroom. She stood there, pointing that manicured finger at her husband, completely severing whatever fragile bond of loyalty they had left. The wealthy investors who had been screaming just moments ago fell into a stunned silence, watching a wife publicly sacrifice her husband to save herself. Jamal looked like he had been physically struck by a freight train. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He stared at Brittany, the woman he had stolen millions to impress, the woman who had happily spent his fraudulent cash on designer clothes and offshore accounts, and he realized in that exact moment that she had never loved him. She only loved the illusion of wealth he provided. The second that wealth was threatened, she discarded him as easily as one discards a broken toy. Vivica let out a guttural sob from her chair, watching her golden child being ripped apart by the very woman she had welcomed into our family with open arms. My mother had praised Brittany for years, claiming she was the perfect high society wife for her perfect son. Seeing that perfect wife turn into a screaming traitor in front of the entire city's elite was a poetic justice I could not have scripted better myself. I watched the pathetic display of betrayal from the stage, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical satisfaction. I had spent my entire life being told I was the flawed one, the broken one, the one who needed to learn how to fit into their immaculate social circle. But looking down at them now, fighting like rats in a sinking ship, I knew I was the only one who had ever been real. I leaned back into the microphone, my voice cutting through the heavy, humid air of the room. I told Brittany that her sudden confession was very dramatic, but ultimately completely useless. I explained to the sea of horrified faces looking up at me that I did not just discover this fraud yesterday. I did not stumble upon the forged documents by accident this week during a random audit. I told them that I am the chief executive officer of a cybersecurity firm, and my network defense protocols caught the initial anomaly in my credit report exactly 6 months ago. The collective breath of the room hitched. The sheer span of time I had kept this secret seemed to terrify them more than the fraud itself. I looked directly at my father, who was still gripping the back of that chair, his knuckles white, his face a mask of pure terror. I told him that for 6 entire months I had sat in silence. I had watched them lease luxury cars. I had watched my mother host expensive tea parties. I had watched Jamal parade around the city as a fake tech visionary, all while knowing they had stolen my identity to fund it all. I had paid their bills and smiled at their insults while quietly building the guillotine they were currently standing under. I explained to the crowd that I did not confront them immediately because I knew exactly how my family operated. If I had simply called the local police, my father would have used his political connections and his church influence to make the problem disappear. He would have twisted the narrative, called in favors, and painted me as a disgruntled daughter making false accusations. He would have used the very pastors and politicians sitting in this room to shield himself from consequence, just like he had shielded Jamal from the consequences of every single mistake he had ever made since childhood. I knew that a local investigation would inevitably leak, giving them time to hide the money and destroy the evidence. I needed a case so airtight, so fundamentally devastating, that no amount of local corruption could save them. I needed to build a federal net so wide that they would all be caught in it together, unable to wriggle free through loopholes or bribes. So I told the crowd. I took the forged loan documents, the offshore banking routing numbers, and the source code for the fake application directly to the federal authorities. I handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation the blueprints to my family's destruction on a silver platter, and I waited patiently for them to build an inescapable fortress of evidence. The timing could not have been more perfect. Just as the words "federal authorities" left my lips, the heavy oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom did not just open, they burst apart. The sound was deafening, like a physical strike against the opulent silence of the room. A flood of men and women wearing tactical gear and dark windbreakers poured into the venue. The bold yellow letters on the back of their jackets spelled out FBI and IRS. This was not local law enforcement arriving to ask polite questions. These were federal agents from the cybercrimes and financial fraud divisions arriving to execute a synchronized takedown. The local elite, the politicians, the pastors, and the wealthy socialites scattered like frightened animals, moving desperately toward the walls to distance themselves from my family. The sheer panic in the room was palpable as the reality of a federal raid unfolded in front of their eyes. Women in expensive gowns tripped over themselves trying to get out of the way of the armed agents. Men who had been shaking my father's hand just an hour ago were now holding their hands up in the air, terrified of being associated with a multi-million-dollar federal crime scene. The lead FBI agent, a tall man with a stern, uncompromising expression, marched directly down the center aisle. He did not care about the crystal chandeliers or the expensive flower arrangements. He walked straight up to Jamal, who was still standing frozen, staring at the federal agents as if they were a hallucination. The agent did not ask politely, and he did not read from a script. He grabbed Jamal's arm, twisting it behind his back with practiced efficiency. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoing across the marble floor was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of accountability, finally catching up to a man who had outrun it his entire life. The agent read him his rights, his voice booming over the residual murmurs of the crowd, listing the charges of wire fraud, interstate identity theft, and running a financial Ponzi scheme. Jamal's knees buckled his weight, dropping as the reality of a 10-year federal prison sentence crushed his spine. The golden child, the man who was supposed to be the future of the family legacy, was now nothing more than a federal inmate sobbing quietly on the floor of a luxury hotel, his designer tuxedo gathering dust from the marble tiles. Another team of agents surrounded my father. Reginald tried to stand tall, trying to summon that booming pastoral voice of authority that had intimidated me my entire life. He adjusted his tie, attempting to project the dignity of a wrongfully accused community leader. He opened his mouth to tell the agents there had been a terrible mistake to demand they call the mayor to insist he was a respected member of the community who deserved to be treated with deference. The agents did not even let him finish his sentence. They did not care about his past political campaigns or his front row seat at the mega church. They grabbed his wrists and slammed the handcuffs shut, pinning his arms behind his back. The great patriarch, the man who had demanded my absolute submission, the man who had looked me in the eyes and called me replaceable, was now being detained in front of 500 people he had spent his life trying to impress. The humiliation was absolute. All his political connections, all his social capital burned to the ground in an instant. There was no respect left in the eyes of his peers, only the cold, hard glare of betrayal from the people he had scammed. While the FBI was securing my brother and father, Brittany realized the net was closing in on her too. She thought her public betrayal of Jamal would save her. She thought playing the victim and screaming about being a clueless wife would make the authorities ignore the millions of dollars she had personally routed into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. She slowly backed away from the main stage, slipping off her designer heels to move faster and quieter. She darted toward the heavy service doors near the catering kitchens, hoping to disappear into the labyrinth of the hotel back hallways and escape into the warm Atlanta night. She pushed the swinging doors open, ready to sprint to freedom, leaving her husband to take the fall. But she did not make it 2 steps into the hallway. A team of IRS criminal investigators was waiting for her in the service corridor, anticipating that the primary money launderer would try to flee. They blocked her path, their badges visible, their expressions completely devoid of sympathy. They informed her that playing the victim does not erase international money laundering and tax evasion. They slapped the handcuffs on her wrists while she screamed and thrashed, ruining her expensive silk gown, sobbing that it was all a mistake and she was just a wife following orders. The agents hauled her back into the ballroom, dragging her past the very investors whose money she had stolen to buy the dress she was currently wearing. Her desperate pleas for help went completely ignored by the crowd she had tried so hard to impress just an hour ago. My mother, Vivica, was left completely alone at her table. Her golden child was in handcuffs. Her husband was being read his Miranda rights, and her daughter-in-law was being dragged through the room by federal agents. The perfect, wealthy, black family she had sacrificed my mental health to build was entirely dismantled, reduced to a spectacle of federal criminality. She fell to the floor, the expensive fabric of her dress pooling around her as she wept uncontrollably, reaching out her hands toward the empty air, begging for someone, anyone, to help her. She looked toward the tables of her sorority sisters and church friends, the women she had relied on for validation and praise. But those women were too busy giving their statements to the federal agents, eager to distance themselves from her toxic orbit. The women who had praised her fake life and validated her smear campaign against me were now actively avoiding eye contact, treating her like a pariah. The narrative she had so carefully orchestrated against me had completely backfired, leaving her utterly isolated and destroyed, surrounded by the ruins of her social empire. I stood on the stage, looking down at the wreckage of their lives. My private security team maintained their formation, ensuring none of the chaos reached the platform. Dion stood quietly beside me, his presence a steady anchor in the storm we had unleashed. We watched as the federal agents began the process of clearing the room, separating the victims from the perpetrators, and cataloging the physical evidence scattered across the gala tables. The sheer scale of the operation was a testament to the magnitude of the fraud my family had committed. They had built an empire of lies, and it took the full force of the federal government to tear it down. The lead FBI agent began to guide my father toward the ballroom exit, preparing to march him through the hotel lobby and out into the waiting federal transport vehicles. The walk of shame was going to be public, brutal, and captured by the cell phone cameras of every former friend in the room. As they walked past the front of the stage, Reginald suddenly stopped fighting the agent's grip. The reality of what was happening finally pierced through his impenetrable arrogance. He realized that his political favors could not save him, his church could not save him, and his golden child certainly could not save him. The only person in the room with the power and the wealth to even attempt to intervene was the daughter he had discarded. He dropped his heavy frame to his knees right there on the polished marble floor, shattering the last remnants of his pride. The agents pulled at his arms, but he went completely limp, refusing to move. He looked up at me, his face streaked with sweat, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate terror. The booming voice of the proud patriarch was completely gone, replaced by the pathetic whimpering of a broken old man facing the end of his life in a federal cell. He stared up at the woman he had abused, discarded, and underestimated for 32 years. The silence in the room seemed to amplify his desperation. The entire ballroom watched as the powerful man was reduced to begging. He yelled out my name, begging me to talk to the agents to tell them it was all a misunderstanding. He screamed, "Please, daughter, pay the bail, we are family." I looked down at the man kneeling on the cold marble floor of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom. The booming, arrogant voice of the patriarch who had terrorized my self-esteem for 32 long and painful years was completely gone. In its place was the pathetic whimpering of a broken man who realized his entire kingdom was built on sand. Reginald stared up at me, his face slick with sweat and tears, his wrists bound tightly behind his back by federal agents. "Please, daughter," he begged me, his voice cracking under his absolute humiliation. "Pay the bail. We are family." I let my eyes drift past him, surveying the absolute carnage of the elite social event they had planned. My mother Vivica was sprawled across the velvet dining chairs a few feet away, sobbing hysterically into her hands. Her expensive makeup was running down her face, staining the designer gowns she bought with stolen funds. Her sorority sisters and church friends had backed away from her completely, as if she were carrying a highly contagious plague across the room. Jamal was thrashing wildly against the grip of 2 FBI agents, screaming frantically for a lawyer. His face twisted in pure panic as they dragged the golden child toward the elevators. Brittany was already gone, hauled away by the Internal Revenue Service, leaving absolutely nothing behind but a very miserable trail of ruined luxury and fraud. I slowly stepped down from the stage, my emerald green silk dress pooling around my ankles as I closed the distance between me and my father. The federal agents paused, sensing that the primary victim of this massive financial crime had one final thing to say to the architect of her suffering. I crouched down gracefully, keeping my back perfectly straight, until my face was only inches away from his. I could smell the expensive cologne he bought with my money, mixing directly with the acrid scent of his terror. He looked into my eyes, searching desperately for the compliant, obedient little girl he had bullied mercilessly for 3 decades. He was exactly looking for the sad, desperate little daughter who always wrote the heavy checks, who always paid the late bills just to easily maintain the stupid fake illusion of his perfect black family. I made sure my voice was barely above a whisper, so soft and clinical that only he could hear the final execution of our relationship. "You told me I was replaceable, Dad," I said, letting the words hang in the air between us. "I strongly suggest you call my replacement to pay your federal bail." I stood up, turning my back on the man who had given me half my DNA and nothing else. Dion was waiting for me at the edge of the security perimeter. His hand extended. I took it, linking my arm firmly through his. We walked together down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The silent crowd of wealthy investors, politicians, and pastors moved aside like the Red Sea. As we walked toward the exit, no one spoke to me. No one tried to stop me. They simply watched the woman who had single-handedly dismantled a criminal empire walk out of the wreckage she had orchestrated. The heavy oak doors closed behind us, cutting off the sound of my mother's wailing and the sharp commands of the federal agents. We stepped out into the warm Atlanta night air, and my lungs expanded with the breath of absolute freedom. 6 months later, the autumn breeze carried a crisp chill across the wrap-around balcony of my new downtown penthouse. I stood at the glass railing holding a crystal glass of imported red wine, looking out over the sprawling, glittering skyline of the city I had conquered. Dion stepped out through the sliding glass doors, wrapping a cashmere blanket around my shoulders and pulling me gently against his chest. The soft jazz playing from the indoor sound system mingled perfectly with the distant hum of the city traffic below. Inside the penthouse, the flat-screen television mounted on the living room wall was playing the evening local news broadcast. The anchor's voice drifted out onto the balcony, clear and professional, wrapping up the final segment on the largest fraud case of the decade. The federal judge had handed down the sentences that morning, closing the book on my family's reign of manipulation. Reginald and Jamal had both been convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, interstate identity theft, and running a financial Ponzi scheme. They were each sentenced to 10 years in federal prison with no possibility of early parole. The golden child and the proud patriarch were sitting in concrete cells, stripped of their unearned arrogance. Brittany had taken a desperate plea deal, testifying against her husband and father-in-law to avoid serving time. But the IRS had seized every asset, leaving her bankrupt and forced to move back in with estranged relatives. I listened to the anchor finalize the broadcast and felt a profound, unshakable stillness settle over my spirit. I picked up the remote control, sitting on the patio table, and pressed the power button. The television screen went black, silencing the ghosts of my past. Forever. I turned around and leaned into Dion, taking a slow, calming sip of my wine. I had survived their cruelty. I had exposed their crimes, and I had completely reclaimed my identity. Today, I looked around at the peaceful sanctuary I had built. I had my thriving corporate empire. I had my wealth securely locked away, and most importantly, I had a partner who protected me and stood by me when the fire was burning. Its hottest, I finally understood the greatest lesson my trauma had taught me. Blood does not make you family. Sharing a last name does not entitle anyone to your peace, your money, or your sanity. Respect is the only currency that builds a true family, and I had finally found mine. The most powerful lesson from this story is that sharing DNA does not obligate you to endure abuse or financial exploitation. True family is never defined by blood alone, but by mutual respect and genuine care. When the people supposed to protect you choose to use you instead, walking away is not betrayal, it is survival. Setting firm boundaries and prioritizing your peace is the only way to break toxic cycles. You always have the power to choose your own family and build a beautiful life completely free from manipulation. Tell us how you found the courage to walk away from a toxic environment in the comments below, and hit subscribe for more empowering stories of survival.